Hey everyone, welcome back to We Are Cosmic, your go-to place for all things cryptocurrency, blockchain, and digital finance. I'm thrilled you're here because today we've got some absolutely mind-blowing news straight from one of the biggest voices in crypto, Jake Claver. And trust me, if you've been following Ripple, XRP, or even thinking about investing in crypto seriously, you don't want to miss a single second of this breakdown. Right off the bat, let's set the scene. Jake Claver sat down with Ray Fuentes in a brand new interview that just dropped on X. And some of the clips are creating shockwaves across the crypto community. We're talking about fresh insights into Ripple, XRP, and even Basel updates that could change the game for global banking and crypto adoption. This is the kind of information that could literally reshape how XRP is used worldwide in the coming years. Now, before we dive into all the heavy details, I want to give you a quick reminder. Everything we discuss here is for educational purposes only. I'm not giving financial advice, but I am here to provide analysis that can help you understand the forces shaping the crypto markets and why XRP could be in a very special position. So, what makes this interview so important? Jake Claver touched on multiple key points that everyone in the XRP space needs to understand. First, he talked about regulation in the U.S., specifically the Clarity Act that Senator Cynthia Lummis has been pushing for. According to Jake, this act should be passed by the end of the year. And let me break down why that's massive. The Clarity Act essentially lays out how digital assets are classified and which authority regulates them, SEC or CFTC. Think of it as the rule book that finally gives institutional investors, hedge funds, and banks the confidence to enter the crypto market without worrying about legal gray areas. Combine that with the Genius Act, which is already signed into law, and you can see the picture forming. The U.S. is finally creating a clear framework for large-scale crypto adoption. Jake explained it brilliantly. Once these rules are in place, the money starts flowing. And we're not talking about just small investors. This is about enterprises, banks, and hedge funds who have trillions in assets ready to deploy efficiently once the regulatory fog clears. For Ripple and XRP, this is huge because it positions them as a bridge between traditional finance and the new world of blockchain-based finance. Here's another fascinating insight from the interview. Jake mentioned that Digital Wealth Partners, the hedge fund he manages, currently has over $200 million worth of XRP actively being used in financial strategies. These aren't just random bets, they're structured financial products, some of which even pay out quarterly cash dividends. This is huge because it shows XRP is not just a speculative token anymore. It's being used in sophisticated financial instruments that are managed professionally, and here's the kicker. Jake's philosophy at Digital Wealth Partners is simple. Rule number 1, don't lose XRP. Rule number 2, refer to rule number 1. That shows a strong conviction in the long-term value of XRP. They're not here for quick profits. They're thinking years, maybe even decades ahead about how XRP fits into the larger financial ecosystem. Jake also shared his vision for the company. He wants Digital Wealth Partners to be like a BlackRock-level institution, but with a focus on people, not just numbers. That's the kind of ambition that tells you where the crypto market is heading. Mainstream adoption, not just niche communities, with assets like XRP, which can act as a settlement layer for cross-border transactions. The potential for growth and integration is massive. Now let's talk macroeconomics for a second. Jake brought up Japan and its experiments with negative interest rates. At one point, banks were literally paying people to borrow money. Crazy, right? But this is important because it impacts fintech companies, especially those tied to stablecoins like Tether or USDC. Here's where Ripple's independence comes in. With the launch of RLUSD, their own fully audited stablecoin, Ripple has severed ties with Tether and USDC. That's a big deal because it shows Ripple is building compliant and scalable infrastructure. In Jake's words, Ripple could be one of the biggest beneficiaries of global liquidity shifts, especially the unwinding of what's called the reverse carry trade, and it gets more personal. At one point in the interview, Ray noticed Jake wearing his XRP pin over his heart and asked what XRP truly means to him. Jake's answer was powerful. He believes that one day XRP may no longer be available to the public. If it becomes the backbone of global financial infrastructure, institutions will hold it, daily demand will remain strong, and supply for retail investors will shrink. That's why XRP is close to his heart, not just symbolically, but as a critical, finite asset in the future financial system. Finally, this part of the story ties perfectly into what Brad Garlinghouse, Ripple's CEO, has said before. He compared XRP to a basketball underwater. For years, the SEC lawsuit suppressed adoption and price, but now that clarity has been achieved, XRP is free to rise. The long-term strategy isn't just about price, it's about building a system that can handle global transactions efficiently, securely, and quickly. We covered Jake Claver's interview, his vision for XRP, and why regulatory clarity in the US is creating a perfect storm for adoption. Now, let's zoom in on Basel, the international banking regulator, and why their recent updates could make XRP one of the most powerful assets in the world. In August 2025, the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision released a letter that has flown under most people's radar. But if you hold XRP or follow Ripple closely, this is extremely important. Here's why. XRP has been explicitly named as a Group 2 asset, a liquid, compliant crypto asset approved for use by global banks. Let me break that down. Basel's framework is essentially a global rule book that tells banks how much risk they can take with each asset. Banks are extremely cautious because every dollar, euro, or yen on their balance sheet must comply with strict risk calculations. If an asset doesn't meet Basel standards, banks simply won't touch it at scale. So, XRP being designated as Group 2 is huge. It tells the world's largest financial institutions, this asset is liquid, compliant, and safe for your balance sheet. That's not just a label, it's a green light for institutional adoption. Banks can now integrate XRP into liquidity systems, manage risk, and trade confidently without fear of regulatory backlash. Think about a mid-sized international bank that has been stuck using slow and expensive SWIFT transfers. The infrastructure works, but it's inefficient, costly, and capital intensive. With XRP now recognized under Basel as compliant and liquid, these banks can start using it for cross-border payments, liquidity management, and instant settlements. That's a game changer in terms of speed, cost, and efficiency. XRP didn't achieve this alone. Ripple's ecosystem is designed to be fully audited, transparent, and globally compliant. With their RLUSD stablecoin, Ripple is independent from USDC and Tether, which removes systemic risks and strengthens trust. Combine that with backing from major investors like SBI and other institutional players, and XRP is now positioned as a major winner in global liquidity flows. But let's go deeper into what Group 2 designation actually means. Basel requires strict criteria for these assets. The asset must be liquid enough to support daily transactions at scale. It must be supported by regulated derivatives, ETFs, or ETNs. It must meet risk mitigation requirements under Basel rules. XRP ticks all these boxes. It has deep liquidity, is traded on regulated exchanges, and is included in hedging instruments recognized by financial institutions. This is the kind of infrastructure banks need to confidently deploy crypto without worrying about penalties. The impact doesn't stop at compliance. Imagine hundreds of banks globally suddenly being able to integrate XRP. The inflow of capital could dwarf what we've seen in Bitcoin ETFs. XRP could become a core bridge asset, used to settle trillions of dollars in transactions faster and cheaper than any existing system. That's why Jake Claver emphasized that XRP may eventually not be available to the public. Institutions will hold the majority of supply, making it scarce and highly valuable. Here's an interesting angle. Basel didn't just approve XRP. They also signaled that global crypto regulations are evolving. They advised regulators to pause updates to the current crypto asset standard, known as SEO 60, and reflect real market conditions. In other words, the rules are shifting in favor of digital assets, not against them. That's an early signal to investors that we're entering a new phase of crypto adoption. And the ripple effect goes further. Professor Fabian Scheer from the University of Basel highlighted that Ripple's system is uniquely designed for interoperability. Unlike some blockchains that operate in isolation, Ripple connects disparate financial networks seamlessly. This is exactly what banks need to move assets efficiently across borders while remaining compliant. Another important point, centralization versus decentralization. Some critics argue that Ripple is more centralized compared to public blockchains like Bitcoin, but for banks, this is actually an advantage. It gives them oversight, control, and compliance while still leveraging blockchain efficiency. Ripple sits in the sweet spot between public accessibility and institutional-grade control. Now let's bring in the global adoption picture. In China alone, the XRP ledger is already linked to over 2,100 major enterprises, 377 financial institutions, and more than 330,000 SMEs. These connections span 29 provinces and 27 countries globally. Companies like ChemChina, China Mobile, China Railway, and even Nike are using XRP infrastructure. This shows XRP isn't just theoretical, it's actively integrated into one of the world's largest economies. Here's the takeaway. Combine Basel compliance, Ripple's independence, and China's enterprise adoption, and you get a perfect storm for XRP adoption. Retail investors still have access today, but institutional dominance could eventually limit public availability. That's why understanding these developments is critical for anyone looking at XRP long-term. So far, we've covered Jake Claver's interview, U.S. regulatory clarity with the Clarity Act, and Basel recognizing XRP as a Group 2 compliant asset. Now, let's take it a step further and look at how these developments could impact XRP's scarcity, institutional demand, and its potential role as the backbone of cross-border payments. Jake Claver made it very clear that XRP is not just another digital asset. He compared it to a finite, highly functional commodity that could become increasingly scarce as global institutions start holding it. Think about it this way. If banks begin using XRP as part of their balance sheets and liquidity management, a significant portion of the supply could be locked up in institutional hands. That leaves less available for retail investors. This is exactly what makes XRP different from many other cryptocurrencies. It's not just a speculative play. It's positioned to be a core infrastructure asset that is required by the financial system itself. When you combine that scarcity with Basel's approval, you get a powerful dynamic. Banks are extremely risk-averse. They won't move unless the asset meets regulatory standards, has liquidity, and can integrate into their systems without creating compliance issues. XRP now ticks all those boxes. This is why hedge funds like Digital Wealth Partners are willing to deploy hundreds of millions of dollars into XRP strategies. They aren't gambling, they're placing calculated bets based on infrastructure, compliance, and real-world adoption. The institutional interest is only going to grow. When you think about cross-border payments, the current system is riddled with inefficiencies. SWIFT is slow and expensive. Banks have to lock up trillions of dollars in Nostro accounts just to facilitate international transfers. XRP, on the other hand, allows instant settlement. With Basel compliance and regulatory clarity, banks can confidently use XRP to move value across borders, saving massive amounts of capital and reducing operational costs. This is not hypothetical. It's a real, tangible advantage that could completely change global financial operations. Another point to consider is the growing integration of Ripple's ecosystem in Asia. China, for example, has already linked XRP Ledger to thousands of enterprises and hundreds of financial institutions. This gives Ripple a head start in one of the world's largest economies. The same principles could apply to Europe, Japan, and other regions as banks look for efficient, compliant, and fast settlement systems. XRP's role as a bridge asset becomes even more critical in this context because it doesn't compete with fiat. It complements it by facilitating instant and compliant transfers. Price dynamics are another layer to this story. Historically, XRP was suppressed due to regulatory uncertainty, much like Brad Garlinghouse compared it to a basketball underwater. Once clarity came from the SEC case and now Basel's recognition, natural market forces are allowed to work. Institutional demand combined with finite supply could create significant upward pressure on price over time. This isn't a pump and dump scenario, it's structural demand that builds as adoption grows. Every bank, hedge fund, or enterprise that uses XRP adds to the pressure because more supply is being locked away in operational use rather than circulating on exchanges. It's also worth noting that the role of XRP in cross-border settlements is not just about moving money faster, it's about unlocking capital efficiency. Banks no longer need to tie up massive amounts of money in static accounts, which can then be redeployed into other financial operations. That efficiency translates into both cost savings and better customer service, giving early adopters a competitive edge. This is why institutional green lights, Basel compliance, and Ripple's technical infrastructure all converge to make XRP extremely attractive to serious investors. Additionally, the global context matters. As more countries explore tokenization of assets, XRP's infrastructure could serve as the backbone connecting these tokenized systems. RippleNet allows interoperability between different blockchains, fiat systems, and digital assets, which is exactly what multinational banks need. This is where XRP stands out compared to other cryptocurrencies. It's not just digital money, it's a functional tool for real-world finance. In summary, XRP's scarcity, institutional adoption, and infrastructure role are all interconnected. Basel compliance and regulatory clarity reduce risk and increase confidence. Institutional holdings reduce supply for retail investors, increasing scarcity. Ripple's infrastructure allows fast, compliant cross-border payments, creating structural demand. When these factors combine, we see a scenario where XRP is positioned to become not just a cryptocurrency, but a fundamental layer of global financial infrastructure. Now let's shift focus to what this means for retail investors and early adopters, while also looking at broader market implications. Understanding these dynamics is critical if you want to make informed decisions in the crypto space. One of the first things to understand is that XRP is entering a phase where institutional and retail dynamics will intersect. Institutional investors like hedge funds and banks are increasingly moving into XRP because it now meets compliance and liquidity standards. This means more supply will be locked into long-term holdings, structured products, and balance sheets. For retail investors, this creates both opportunities and challenges. On one hand, scarcity could drive price appreciation over time. On the other hand, it might mean less availability for average investors as institutions dominate supply. Timing and strategy become key. Let's break down how this scarcity could impact the market. Unlike Bitcoin, which is widely recognized as a store of value, XRP's primary utility is cross-border settlement and liquidity management. When banks and enterprises adopt XRP, they aren't flipping it on exchanges, they're using it operationally. That reduces circulating supply, which naturally creates upward pressure on price if demand continues to grow. Jake Claver and Brad Garlinghouse both emphasize that XRP's long-term value isn't about speculation, it's about becoming an integral infrastructure asset. For retail investors, this presents a window of opportunity that may not last forever. XRP is still accessible on major exchanges, but as more institutions come in, availability may shrink. Being aware of these market dynamics is important. You want to focus not just on price, but on understanding the fundamental role XRP is playing in the financial ecosystem. This mindset separates long-term investors from short-term traders. Market implications also go beyond price. As Ripple integrates with banks globally and more countries recognize XRP's compliance, we could see a new wave of digital finance adoption. Imagine a future where multinational corporations and banks settle trillions in value daily using XRP. That isn't a small market. It's the backbone of global liquidity. In such a scenario, even a modest increase in adoption could represent massive flows of capital, creating significant ripple effects across the crypto market. Another factor to consider is technological adoption. RippleNet and XRP Ledger allow interoperability across multiple networks, which is critical as more assets become tokenized. Banks and institutions need systems that can handle both fiat and digital assets efficiently. XRP's infrastructure positions it uniquely because it can act as a bridge asset, connecting traditional finance with blockchain-based solutions. This is why we're seeing institutional players take it seriously. Now, let's talk about price potential in this context. While nobody can predict exact numbers, the structural demand is clear. Institutions adopting XRP reduces supply while increasing operational demand. Retail investors entering early can benefit from this structural growth rather than chasing short-term pumps. Historically, XRP's price has been constrained by regulatory uncertainty. With the SEC case resolved, Basel recognition achieved, and enterprise adoption growing globally, the foundation for sustained growth is now firmly in place. It's also worth highlighting that XRP isn't trying to replace the entire financial system, it's a bridge layer. This is an important distinction. Many investors get caught up comparing it to Bitcoin or Ethereum. While those assets have their roles, XRP's value proposition is different. It's about enabling fast, compliant settlements and improving liquidity efficiency. When trillions of dollars are flowing through financial systems, even a small slice of that captured by XRP represents massive real-world demand. From a strategic perspective, early adopters should focus on education and timing. Knowing how regulatory developments, global bank adoption, and infrastructure integration affect demand is far more important than short-term price movements. Jake Claver and other institutional leaders are signaling that XRP's trajectory is long-term and structural. This means investors who understand the ecosystem are better positioned to make informed decisions and capitalize on these shifts before the broader market catches on. Finally, we should remember that global adoption is accelerating. China's enterprises, Asia-Pacific banks, and even Western institutions are increasingly connected to Ripple's infrastructure. This is creating a network effect. The more participants in the system, the more essential XRP becomes for daily operations. This isn't just theoretical, it's already happening. The combination of compliance, liquidity, institutional integration, and cross-border use creates a perfect storm for structural demand, which is why both retail and institutional players are paying close attention. We've already covered regulatory clarity, Basel compliance, institutional adoption, scarcity, and market dynamics. Now it's time to look at the bigger picture and the long-term implications. First, it's important to recognize that XRP is no longer just a speculative asset. With Basel designating it as a Group 2 compliant asset and global institutions integrating RippleNet into their operations, XRP is now functioning as a key component of financial infrastructure. This shift changes the narrative completely. No longer is XRP merely a token people trade, it's becoming a tool banks and enterprises rely on for cross-border payments, liquidity management, and settlement. That structural demand is what separates XRP from many other cryptocurrencies in the market. As adoption grows, scarcity will become a critical factor. Institutions will hold XRP for operational use, reducing the circulating supply available to retail investors. Jake Claver highlighted that XRP could eventually become rare and difficult to access for the public. This is not fear-mongering, it's a reflection of the asset's utility and its increasing importance in global financial systems. Early adopters who understand this dynamic are positioned to benefit from long-term structural demand rather than short-term speculative movements. The pace of adoption is also accelerating. China has already integrated thousands of enterprises and hundreds of financial institutions into the XRP ledger. Europe and Asia are closely monitoring Basel's guidance, while the US is progressing toward regulatory clarity with the Clarity Act. Ripple's independence from Tether and USDC via its RLUSD stablecoin further strengthens its credibility and scalability. When you put all these pieces together, you see a global adoption network forming, banks, enterprises, and regulators all recognizing the utility and compliance of XRP. Price implications naturally follow from these structural dynamics. Historically, XRP's price was constrained by regulatory uncertainty, which suppressed growth, like Brad Garlinghouse compared to holding a basketball underwater. Now that barriers are removed, price discovery can occur based on real-world adoption and demand. Institutions moving large sums of capital into XRP, coupled with limited supply and circulation, create a scenario where upward price momentum is likely over time. This isn't hype, it's the natural outcome of infrastructure-driven demand. For retail investors, understanding the long-term strategy is crucial. Short-term price fluctuations may occur, but the bigger picture is about positioning yourself within a system that is becoming integral to global finance. XRP's role as a bridge asset, connecting traditional banking networks with blockchain infrastructure, ensures that its utility is ongoing. Investors who focus on fundamentals, adoption trends, and structural demand are more likely to benefit than those chasing quick gains. Institutional integration also drives market confidence. Hedge funds like Digital Wealth Partners, managing hundreds of millions in XRP and offering structured products with quarterly dividends, signal a new level of maturity in crypto investment strategies. This shows that XRP is not just being held passively, it's being actively used in professional, regulated financial products. That level of conviction is a strong indicator that adoption and demand will continue to rise over the coming years. Looking further ahead, XRP could play a central role in the tokenization of global assets. Analysts predict that 5 to 10% of financial assets could be on-chain within the next decade. Even a fraction of this massive market flowing through XRP would have a transformative effect on both its value and influence. Ripple's strategy is to integrate XRP as the settlement layer and bridge asset across multiple financial systems, not to replace them entirely. That makes its position extremely valuable because every transaction that flows through these systems may touch XRP in some way. Global collaboration is also key. G7 and G20 working groups, along with international regulators, are increasingly aligned on the frameworks necessary for cross-border digital asset adoption. Ripple's infrastructure is uniquely positioned to leverage these developments, providing interoperability, compliance, and efficiency. This combination of regulatory alignment, institutional trust, and technological capability makes XRP a prime candidate for long-term structural growth. In conclusion, XRP is evolving from a cryptocurrency into an essential piece of the global financial system. Regulatory clarity in the US, Basel's Group 2 recognition, institutional adoption, and real-world use in enterprises worldwide all signal that we're witnessing a fundamental shift. Scarcity, demand, and infrastructure integration create a compelling long-term growth story. For early adopters, retail investors, and institutions alike, understanding XRP's evolving role is key to making informed decisions. The narrative is no longer about speculation. It's about XRP becoming a core, compliant, and indispensable tool in global finance.